Terry Hodge is a gardener with the Orchid collection at the U.S. Botanic Garden. Before joining the garden, he was an orchid horticulturalist with the Olbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. Terry earned his master's in horticulture from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is originally from Kansas City, Missouri. Welcome, Terry. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, very excited about this session today.
Great. So I wondered if we could start out just hearing a little bit about your work. You shared some photos with us that we can share so people see a few things up close. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is just a little bit about how you got interested in orchids. What drew you to working with orchids?
Yeah, so I've kind of been interested in horticulture most of my life. My first job was at a nursery back in Kansas City, but orchids specifically, I became very interested in them in 2016. At the time, I was working at a botanical garden in France, and I had the opportunity to work in their different public display greenhouses. And we would get all these shipments of different orchids, Phalaenopsis, Cattleya, in, and it was really wonderful to sort of see those orchids coming in, and I just got really intrigued, and I started going deeper on them. Yeah, and so it was really there that I fell in love with them. Then I went on to do my master's degree working in tomatoes. Totally not, anything to do with orchids, but I kept that as a side interest, and then eventually got the job at Olbrich Botanical Gardens working in their orchid collection, and that's when things really just kind of took off. And the photo that you're looking at now, I would say, is the orchid that sort of solidified my interest in this family of plants. This is fragmapedium bessier. It's just a spectacular orchid. Yeah, the pouch, the lip that you see there has these really intricate sort of window-like portions of it. And so this was the orchid that sort of, solidified my interest in this plant group.
Great. Thanks, Terry. Yeah, that's beautiful. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the orchid collection that you care for now at the U.S. Botanic Garden?
Yeah, sure. So the orchid collection here at the USBG has about 3,500 different orchids of all different kinds. Orchids are one of the largest plant families in the world. Some estimates of more than 30,000 different species. And so our collection, of course, is just a representation of that, a small representation, but it still remains one of the largest in the country. So like I said, around 3,500 different orchids. Within that, we have particular groups that are more represented than others. So the Paphiopedilum, Asian lady slipper orchids are a group that we have quite a few of. And then in addition, we have a Cattleya collection that was actually donated in large part by a Virginia orchid grower, Joe Francis, in 2018. And that's a really special collection to the garden. A lot of interesting Cattleya species, but also historic hybrids that have a lot of cultural value. And then, of course, we have tons of other odds and ends throughout the collection as well.
Great. Thanks, Terry. And can you talk to us a little bit about sort of the work that you do? What are some of the projects that you work on a day-to-day basis? And what are some of the things you've been up to lately?
Yeah, so most recently, we've been doing a lot of repotting of different orchids. So in particular, the Paphiopedilum collection, which I kind of mentioned just a moment ago, I've been repotting those, and also the Phalaenopsis collection. So as we're moving into spring, we're getting more light, things are heating up. The plants are sort of starting to grow more actively. So it's a really great time to sort of get into the repotting time. And so that's exactly what we've been doing. So here's a photo here of some different Paphiopedilum slipper orchids, all recently repotted. We've worked our way through about maybe half of the collection at this point. So we definitely have more work ahead of us. Here's another photo of those closer up, those lady slipper orchids. And then here's the Phalaenopsis collection. A lot of you might be familiar with Phalaenopsis. It's one of the the most common orchid that you can sort of buy, grocery store orchid, what have you. And there's a lot of different species. Most of our collection are species, not the hybrids you find in the stores. And we've been repotting those as well.
Great. Thanks, Terry. And then you are actually right now in the orchid house in the conservatory. Make sure that people see the background there and see some of beautiful orchids behind you. Can you talk to us a little bit about that space? You know, what are the conditions of the space? What's usually on display in there?
Sure. Yeah. So the orchid house here at the conservatory is very unique. We have a large collection, as I said, and the public really only gets to interact with a small portion of that at a time. And that all pretty much happens in this room where I'm in now, the orchid room, and the conservatory. And so we cycle through what's in bloom, so that people can sort of see. And so we have a ton of different orchids in here right now, in bloom: Cattleya, Dendrobium, Paphiopedilum. The conditions in here are conducive to orchids for the most part. It could potentially be a little bit brighter, but we have the structure of the greenhouse that we have to play with. But we're able to dial in some different microclimates to really put the things that we have on display for the public.
Great, thanks, Terry. It's a beautiful
Mhm.
space. So we are going to now turn over to some participant questions and have you sort of respond to some of the things people are interested to hear about.
Sure, let's
So
go
the
for it.
first one, somebody asked, what is the difference between fragmapedium bessier and della sandro?
Okay. So this has, I think, been kind of a perennial debate for quite a long time. One of the things that I remember is that the lateral petals on Delisandro are a bit more narrow, and they often tend to be multi-branched. They're also found in slightly different areas down in South America. Um, that's my answer for that, without going too deep. I don't want to say something wrong, but those I know for sure.
Perfect, thank you. Somebody else said that they were eager to learn about propagating native orchids of New England. They're attempting Spiranthes cernia right now. Do you have any tips for them as they're looking at native orchids?
Okay. So I have to say, on native orchids, native terrestrials, that is an area that I'm not as familiar with.
Mhm.
I know they can be really finicky because you have to deal with sort of like seasonal changes and getting like the right temperature during certain seasons. And there's a deciduous period for most of them. But I can't really speak too much to that. It could be something that this person could potentially reach out to the plant hotline that we run, for some follow up about that.
Great, thanks. And we'll share a link to that plant hotline so people can reach out that way as well. Here's a question. Somebody said, when you're referring to grocery store orchids as hybrid orchids, does that mean they're taken care of or grown differently than other orchids?
No, not necessarily. A hybrid just means that there were two species that existed in nature, and then they were crossed to create a hybrid. And then from that, you can also cross hybrids. So it kind of gets really complex pretty quickly. But for the most part, care is very similar. And actually, hybrids are usually easier to take care of than a lot of the pure species that you could have. So it's always a good orchid to start with.
Great, thank you. So you had shown a number of photos of repotting, and people are wondering about that. Do you repot all orchids once a year? Sort of, what's the guideline for the work that you're doing?
Sure. So repotting is a question that usually comes up. And, if you go online and you do some research, most advice will say to repot, every 2 years or so. And the reason for that is the orchid media starts to break down. It becomes less porous and more like a true soil. And that can usually hurt the orchid roots. Basically, it kind of suffocates them. And so that's the reason for repotting on a regular schedule, is to freshen the media up and allow the air that the orchid roots need to sort of get into the roots. And so usually at the BG here, we try to stay on that schedule, but we have so many orchids that sometimes it's difficult to do. And then you just kind of have to play it by ear. If your media is holding up longer, it's not sort of decomposing, you could probably get by, for a longer period of time when you repot. And then another thing that might come up is sort of what mix you repot in. Here we repot almost everything in a bark-based mixed with a little bit of inorganic material like pumice or perlite. And that allows us to really have the drainage and the airflow in addition to the water holding capacity that we need. a lot of grocery store orchids, or the Phalaenopsis is what I'm referring to primarily, are grown in sphagnum peat moss. And that's another good media. You just have to kind of make some adjustments in how you do your care or your culture with those orchids.
Great, thanks. And you spoke to this a little bit, but someone was asking about the value of repotting. In their case, their Phalaenopsis have rebloomed without doing that. So sort of what's your rule of thumb to know like when you should versus when you don't need to?
Yeah. So it really depends. For me, what I would do if I was curious, okay, does my plant need to be repotted? I would think about things like, is it blooming? Do the leaves look okay? Is it actively growing? And if all of those things are the case, then maybe you can push off repotting. A lot of times when the potting mix needs to be replaced, the plant will start to tell you. You'll get some yellowing, you'll see some root die back, or even dehydration because of the roots dying back because they're in that sort of stagnant mix. So those are some of the signs that I look for when, considering whether or not it's time to repot. The other thing is if a plant is just sort of outgrowing its current pot, that can be another time to do it, because you want to try to contain it as best you can and give the plant sort of the best setup for growth in the future.
Great, thanks. Someone said that they repotted their Phalaenopsis and their Cattleya. They split the Cattleya into 3 plants, and wondering how long does it take for the orchids to recover and start growing again?
Okay, so usually when you split something like a Cattleya, it's advised to keep at least 3 to 5, 3 minimum pseudobulbs, and those are just the little canes that kind of the orchid's growing along with. And that's so it has enough energy to sort of be able to sort of reestablish itself and put out the new roots. And it kind of depends how long. It needs light and it needs humidity initially, especially because whenever you repot, in some ways it's kind of like a surgery. It's a sort of traumatic event for the plant, and so it takes some time to recover. If you can give it the care that it needs, as I mentioned, light and humidity to kind of like allow it to ease along, usually they'll respond pretty well and put out some new roots. The one thing that is important to do is timing. So like I said, we're in spring right now. Days are starting to get longer. Temperatures are warmer. That's usually a good time to repot. If you do stuff in the dead of winter, it's not as much light, the plants can really struggle. That said, a lot of times if it's an emergency, you should just try to repot then and there to try to save the plant. But if you have some time, it's best to do it in spring or
Great.
summer. Yeah.
Yeah, good tip. Someone said they have had a Militonia for about 5 years now. For the last 6 months, it's been declining. Some of the parts have turned brown and crunchy, and now have spots. They've tried watering more, but do you have any tips for them?
Sure. If there's sort of black spots, that could be indicative of some type of disease, potentially fungal, maybe bacterial. I would ask sort of how long the plant has been in that pot. Maybe is the media broken down to the point where the roots, don't have as much oxygen and sort of are stagnant. And then the other thing to think about, my mother-in-law, she grows a lot of orchids, and she always asks me questions, and she's really good at it. She's had some Phalaenopsis for close to 10 years, but there is a life cycle to some of these plants as well, and eventually they will decline to some degree, and so it could be part of that as well.
Great, thanks. We have another question related to watering. Someone said they recently got their first orchid, and the care instructions say that they should give it half a cup of water per week. They're wondering if that should be a little bit throughout the week, or should they do it all at once?
Okay, that's a good question. And watering is always a touchy topic with orchids. It's really the number one way that orchids die, is overwatering. So the first thing I would say is I'd ask the question, is it in sort of that moss mix that I was talking about earlier, the New Zealand sphagnum moss, or is it in a bark-based mix? Because that will kind of depend. My feeling is that it's in a moss mix if it's just a half a cup of water per week. And the thing is, you could probably get by with that. You just have to sort of communicate with your plant, and see, like, is the media actually drying out? It's hard on some of these orchids to be on a schedule. because during different times of the year, they might be processing more water than other times. And so you really kind of have to look at the media, ask yourself, okay, is this dry? Is it approaching dryness? And go from there. That said, a lot of the instructions can allow people to have orchids in their home, and they're a little bit more foolproof. And I think you can have good success with that. It just might not be the most optimal of ways of going about it.
Great. Thanks, Terry. We have
Mhm.
questions about orchids and blooming. Someone said, do you have any tips on making them bloom more often?
Sure. So this is another question that comes up pretty often. And at least for the Phalaenopsis orchid, the common orchid that most people have, and I guess really in large part, mini orchids, the one reason that a lot of them don't bloom or people have trouble getting them to bloom is because of light. So orchids, just like all plants, they need a sufficient amount of light in order to build up the energy stores in order to bloom. And so that's usually the first thing that I tell people, or ask them, does the plant get enough light? And so, you have to sort of look at your space, your growing space, your home, your apartment, whatever it may be, and see, where do I have the most light, and try to prioritize that space for your orchid. Now, keep in mind that sometimes if you put the orchid really close to the window, that can be really intense light, but also associated with intense heat. And the heat is what sort of burns the orchid. But short of burning the leaves, most plants in the home, you can try to give as much light as you can. And so that's one of the things that you could do to try to get them to rebloom. The other thing is that a lot of times orchids need some sort of cooling period to initiate a flower spike. And so for Phalaenopsis, that usually tends to happen in the fall, because we get those cooler nights just naturally. And so for Phalaenopsis, usually it's advised to sort of have a temperature drop at the nighttime period between like 58 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit in order to try to initiate that flower spike. And you can do that for like maybe 4 to 6 weeks. It's as simple as maybe moving it closer to a drafty window at night to sort of benefit from that cool air.
Thanks, Terry. There's a question about a specific type. Brassia Rex is what they have. It's growing new leaves, but it does not flower and hasn't done so for several years. Do you have any advice on some of the advice you just shared apply to that one, or anything
Right.
specific?
Yeah, that would be still my go-to advice for that, would be to try to get it a little bit more light. Maybe you have to move it around your house a little bit to find the best location. But I would suspect that it might be a light issue, at least initially.
Thanks. We have
Mm-hmm.
a question about how long do orchids keep their flowers? They've tried to keep orchids, but they tend to lose their flowers quickly and don't seem happy.
Okay. So a couple of things here. First of all, it kind of depends. A lot of the orchids, the most common orchids, can keep their flowers for quite a long time, like the Phalaenopsis, for example. I have one at home in bloom right now that's been blooming for, I want to say, maybe 6 weeks at this point. And so there's that, but then there's also some that basically lose their orchid flowers in one day. It really just kind of depends. A lot of times what happens when you're bringing orchids home that are in flower, the change of environment can be such a shock, or the walk from the store to your car, especially if it's in a cooler time of the year, it can be enough of a shock that a lot of those flowers will just fall off, sort of abort in some ways. And so that is another thing. When you're moving the plant in a cooler time period, it's good to sort of kind of protect it with a plastic bag or something like that to give it the best chance, of not having such a strong temperature shock.
Thanks. Yeah. Here, a related question. Someone asked about how long they keep their flowers, but how long do orchids live? Someone said they have one that's 13 to 14 years old.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it's interesting because the way orchids grow, there are some that in theory could live forever, because they kind of just grow along this rhizome for many of them. Some of them grow straight up. But I was visiting a orchid collection in France, in Paris, really wonderful Paphiopedilum Asian lady slipper orchid collection that started many, many years ago. And they actually had some orchids that were in the collection since the late 1800s. So it's not exactly the same growth, but like I said, because they're putting out new growth every once in a while, it's the same plant. And so in theory, a lot of them could last forever, but in practice, disease and other things kind of keep them from ever achieving that. But 15 years is pretty good. So congrats to whoever did that.
Yeah, that's great. Someone else said they've had a couple Phalaenopsis scilurania that came in sphagnum and were happy for a few years, but then transplanted into a bark mix and all the roots died. They're
Okay.
wondering, did they shock them by taking away that moist sphagnum environment?
Yeah. So orchid roots are interesting because they kind of adapt to whatever mix they're initially grown in. And so when you move from something like sphagnum into bark, it can kind of shock the plant. Those particular roots might not be as well adapted to something that's more airy and less moist. So this person was kind of on the right track with that. A lot of times they'll put out a new flush of roots, but if they don't, then the plant will kind of, just decline because it can't take up the water and the nutrients that it needs. And so you have to be really careful when you're moving from one mix to another. Just trying to take extra special care when you do that.
Great, thank you. A few questions about fertilizer. Someone's asking, just is it necessary?
Yeah. So the thing about fertilizer is that it's kind of this complex thing. I remember when I was first learning about orchid fertilizers, I had a hard time sort of digesting all the information out there. I would say that for someone who has just a couple plants and they're kind of just, want to have something around, that it might not be as important. But as you start to get a larger collection, it's good to introduce some amount of fertilizer from time to time. And there's a couple different schools of thought. Some people use orchid formulated fertilizer, and they do it at a very low dose at every single watering, with the idea that that kind of mimics how the plants are receiving nutrients in nature. Every time it rains, they'll get a little bit of nutrient. But then there's people who also just do it like once a month or every second or third watering and alternate with just plain clear water. So there's a couple different, ways of doing it. And I would say just find something that works best for you. For me here in the orchid collection, we do a constant feed. It's just easier. And when I say that, it means we do fertilizer at every time we water. And that's just easier because I don't have to keep track of when I fertilized last. It's a much easier system. And that might be, that might be a good thing for some people, but other people who are on top of, planning out their watering schedule, they'll know like, okay, this is the third time I'm going to fertilize this time. That's fine too. Just kind of play around and find what works best for you.
Thanks. And then a couple of people have said some of the things they've tried, things like fish emulsion, kelp. Do you have any recommendations for what sorts of ingredients are best to use for growth and then for flowering?
Yeah. So I would say that, again, just a sort of basic orchid fertilizer that's formulated for your water type is going to give you a very good baseline. And then you can also always introduce some other type of plant supplements. So we use kelp here in the orchid collection at the USBG. It's a really great supplement because it has a lot of different plant hormones and other nutrients that sort of stimulate and create really robust growth. So we do that usually once a month. So that's definitely an option. And then you can get into other supplementation, like using magnesium, usually in the form of like Epsom salt or magnesium sulfate is an option to sort of level up, if you will, your growing. So yeah, that's my advice on that.
Thank you. Question about pots. Someone says they work in a greenhouse and people often come in looking for new pots to transplant their orchids into. Do you have a specific kind of pot you recommend? They were saying that they often tend to come in plastic and often they're root bound in those cases.
Yeah. So again, this is kind of a preference. We have orchids in our collection that are in terracotta pots, so clay pots, and we also have some that are in plastic. And each has its own, benefits. Terracotta is going to breathe a bit more. It's going to dry out faster, more uniformly because it's porous, whereas plastic will hold more humidity. It will dry sort of from the top to the bottom. And so it's good to know all those things when you're deciding on what kind of pot to use. And then you kind of have to consider how you grow. Are you someone who likes to be heavy-handed with watering? If so, then maybe a terracotta pot will be a bit more forgiving because it's going to hold less water for, a shorter amount of time. If you like to let things kind of go for longer, you can definitely use a plastic pot. I will say that plastic tends to be a bit more sanitary. You can kind of clean it a little bit better than the porous terracotta. But then there's also the aesthetic side to think about. Terracotta usually looks a little bit better. But you can grow them in either of those options.
Thank you. We have a few questions about pests and diseases, so we'll go to those ones.
Okay.
Someone asked, is there a successful way to deal with scale on orchids, or do they just need to start over?
Okay, so scale can be tricky. For the home grower, the easiest way, especially if you have a smaller collection, is to try to just physically wash off or remove as much as you can. And then sometimes you can do like a diluted soap solution or a diluted rubbing alcohol solution. And those can be pretty beneficial to sort of help you eradicate the pest problem. You kind of have to just be diligent when you do that and follow up, every couple of days and keep an eye on it. That's usually the advice I give. Of course, you can look for some more heavy duty type pesticides, but for the home grower, usually those aren't really a good option, I would say.
Thanks. And then another question about mealybugs. The person said it's a constant issue with their orchids. They try to pick them off individually and wash them with lukewarm water and even wipe off the leaves and the joints with alcohol-dipped Q-tips.
Okay.
Is there any reliable way to control them that won't damage the plant?
Yeah, I think they're kind of doing everything that I would suggest. I would say, try to maybe just be very diligent, like I said, and come back and do that every time to try to attack all the generations of the plant and really focus on some of the small nooks and crannies of the plant, because mealybugs usually, they like to get really far down. And so you kind of have to go digging for them in order to find exactly where they are. But they're doing exactly what I would suggest. You can maybe do a little bit more radical and really douse the top of the plant into sort of a soapy solution. So that's what I would say on that.
Thanks. Here's a question about the soil medium or the bark medium. They asked about what size should the bark be?
Okay. Yeah, so this is another good question because there's a lot of different types of bark sizes. So this is a picture here of a Phalaenopsis species, and you can see, for the most part, you can kind of tell the size of the bark, and then the perlite there, the white stuff. Usually, it's suggested to size the size of the bark to the size of the root. You wouldn't want to use something that has very small roots. You wouldn't want to necessarily use a very big pieces of bark. And so that's sort of my take on that. I will say that like a medium-sized bark, like middle of the grades in terms of size, is usually good for most orchids.
And we had one specific question for Oncidiums. Do they prefer a fine bark mix? And this person said theirs are several years old and fairly large.
Okay. Yeah. For the most part, depending on what type of Oncidium, they do have smaller roots. And so you could probably use a finer bark mix for those, for sure. Just try to size the bark to the roots and how thick they are.
Great, thank you. Someone is asking about the use of Epsom salts. What is the amount of Epsom salts to a gallon of water that you would use in order to increase magnesium?
Okay. So It kind of depends. There's a lot of different recommendations out there. I've seen anything from like a quarter teaspoon to a gallon up to 1 teaspoon per gallon. Um, and then, that depends on how often you're going to do it. Is it once a month, every 2 weeks? But I do think that it's very beneficial. We've seen a lot of good results in terms of supplementing with Epsom salts or magnesium sulfate. And in the collection here, I believe that we use right around 1 teaspoon per gallon once a month.
Thank you. Here's a really interesting one. Someone said they read that to shine the leaves, you could use mayonnaise. Have you heard that? And does it hurt the orchid?
No, I've never heard that. But I could imagine that if you used like a small enough amount, the oil in there probably would. Sometimes people may be familiar with like leaf shine. It's essentially just a type of oil. So I think that's probably what it is. When I was in Madison, we had really hard water, and so it'd leave a lot of water spots on the orchid leaves. And one of the ways that we got rid of that was actually with a diluted lemon juice solution. So it's just enough acid to kind of dissolve the hard water off of the leaves, and it gave it a nice shine too. So yeah, there's many different ways, but I had never heard of mayonnaise. That's very unique.
Thanks, Terry. Someone said they once had an orchid with flowers that smelled like coconut. They loved it, and they can't recall its name. Do you know what orchid this might be?
Yeah, the coconut orchid, pretty sure that's Maxillaria tenuifolia. So it's a type of an orchid sort of native to South America. It has a very strong coconut smell. So that would be the name to look up, Maxillaria tenuifolia, I believe, the coconut orchid.
That sounds cool. Someone else is asking the best way to create an orchid arrangement. Can you pot them together with other orchids?
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, running a collection, we keep things pretty much separate. But if you are going to do a display and you want to actually pot stuff together and you have a big enough pot to do it, I don't see why not. I think the only thing to keep in mind would be, do they have similar watering requirements, light requirements, and things like that? You want to compose your pot with plants that would have that would need similar conditions. It's a great idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said, how would you optimize Cymbidium potting medium? Do these terrestrial orchids like some dirt in them? They said theirs are 40 plus years old, originally from their parents.
Okay. Yeah, so Cymbidiums are a sort of terrestrial orchid from Asia, and there's a lot of different mixes that you can do. And it's true that some people will do sort of a true potting mix with very small particles, almost like a soil. And so you could go that direction, or you could go something that's a little bit more bark based and well draining. The only thing is that you're going to have to just change some of your other cultural or your care as you do that. So for example, if you have something like a true soil, you'll need to water less often because it will dry out slower. If you have a bark-based mix, it's definitely going to dry out faster. So you have to change some of your watering and fertilizing, depending on what kind of media you choose.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How often should I prune an orchid's roots? Someone's asking.
Okay. Yeah, so pruning roots, a lot of times, if you go to repot a plant, an orchid, you will probably have some general dieback, just from the fact that it's been in that pot for maybe a couple of years or more. And so once you remove those plants, a lot of times you're left with, a good amount of roots. But if it's a really vigorous root system, you can sort of trim off some of the roots as long as you're leaving a good amount. And that usually is, that's usually fine to do. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. Another one is someone's asking, can they put orchids in a terrarium? What orchids would work best, and then how should they plant them?
Okay. You could definitely put some orchids in a terrarium. There's some different sort of terrestrial orchids that you could do if you're going to actually plant them in some sort of, media. But then you could also have mounted miniature orchids that you hang, sort of wrapped around cork and with a little bit of moss, and you could hang those or mount those in the terrarium as well. And then you just want to, keep an eye on the conditions, make sure the humidity and the temperature and things like that are in the optimal range. And you could go from there. You could really create something really beautiful in a terrarium using orchids.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question about a different location. Someone else is interested in growing orchids outdoors in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. What slipper orchids could they be growing outdoors?
Okay. So slipper orchids usually they like lower light in general. And so if you were going to consider growing a slipper orchid outdoors, you would want to make sure that they're not going to get too much bright sun. So they need to be sort of protected, maybe under a deck or something like that. And you'd also want to keep in mind the temperatures. It can get really hot here in DC, and a lot of the lady slipper orchids from Asia, and then even the lady slipper orchids from South America, the fragmapedium, they don't like temperatures to be too hot. And that's why usually growing them indoors is a better option. But I always encourage people, if it's a plant that you don't mind experimenting with, to just kind of go for it. But that would be my one caveat, would to be to make sure it doesn't get too hot and too much light.
Thank you. Do you have recommendations for orchids other than Phalaenopsis that are good for beginners?
Yeah. Okay. So the Phalaenopsis is sort of, the perfect plant. But if you want to venture out from there, we've been mentioning the Paphiopedilum slipper orchid. Those are a really good option. There's a lot of hybrids of those that are really forgiving, and they have very similar care needs as the Phalaenopsis. They might not be as rewarding in terms of flower. They usually have one flower, not this nice spread, but it's definitely a good beginner orchid. And then from there, you could venture out into things like Dendrobiums and some of the other more common varieties.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question. Do you have recommendations for the best orchids for low light parts of the house?
Yeah. So in general, it kind of depends on the amount of light, of course, but Phalaenopsis and Paphiopedilum orchids usually take lower light. But the thing is, a lot of times in people's homes, the light is very, very low. Even if it's right next to a window, you cut a lot of the light off. And so I just be sort of, I guess, cognizant of that as you're making your decision of what plant to bring in into the home. Yeah.
Thanks, Terry.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to grow orchids from seed? How could someone do that?
Yeah, so this is a good question. It's an interesting question because in nature, many orchids, once they're pollinated, they form this sort of capsule or a seed pod. It's a capsule that has up to millions of different tiny dust-like seed in it. And then that seed sort of, the capsule opens and the seed disperses, lands on a tree if it's, in the tropics. And it usually depends, actually almost always depends on some sort of fungus to help that plant germinate and get the nutrients it needs right from the beginning. And so those fungus are usually very specific to the type of orchid. And so it's very difficult to grow orchids just straight from seed. And what we have to do is grow them usually under sterile culture on a media that is nutrient rich, in these things that we call flasks. Essentially a sterile jar with a bunch of nutrients at the bottom. You sow the seeds on there, and then they're able to grow that way. So you can do it at home, but you need quite the setup. But there are people that do it. So yeah, you can grow them from seed, but it's a little bit more complicated than you might expect.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions about orchid care. One person's asking, at the garden in your collection, how do you regulate watering? Do you do that overhead watering, hand watering, and how often?
Okay. Yeah. So for the most part, we water everything by hand here. That gives us time to sort of interact with the plant weekly, usually multiple times a week. And it really just depends on the season. So in the winter, when we've had a lot of cloudy days, the plants might go for 3 or 4 days at a time. But then in the heat of summer, they're going to be processing a lot more water and they'll dry out faster. So maybe they need water every 2 days. It really kind of depends. We try not to get into too much of a firm schedule because, again, there is a lot of nuance with the seasons, light and temperature and things like that.
Thank you. Here's a question. Someone's asking about sanitizing tools. Do you need to sanitize your tools before trimming orchids?
Yeah. So sanitation is always a good idea with orchids because they do have issues with diseases and pests, and particular virus can be an issue. And so by sanitizing, you're sort of minimizing the risk that you're going to spread something from one plant to another. Mm-hmm. And so you can sanitize by burning the implement with a flame. You can use some sort of disinfectant. A lot of those aren't necessarily going to kill a lot of the virus, but they'll help with some of the other like fungal and bacterial pathogens. And so that it's always a good idea. Here in the collection at the USBG, we try to have a good sanitation protocol. So using clean cutting instruments every time we sort of interact with a plant, whether it's repotting or removing spent flower buds and things like that.
Thank you. Here's a question. Do you have any orchids in the outdoor collection at the USBG?
Not that I know of. I will say that we grow our Cymbidiums in a small hoop house that in the summer we just have like a very fine mesh screen over. So they're basically outside for the most part in the summertime. But I'm not sure if we have any sort of out in the grounds area of the garden. I'd have to double check. I don't think so, but.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question going back to the sanitation question. Can you talk about how you go about sanitizing the tools at the U.S. Botanic Garden?
Sure. Yeah. So me personally, the way that I do it is I use a new razor blade every time I'm cutting a plant, and then I recycle those razor blades after. So that just ensures that it's a clean cutting implement. And I try not to use pruners or things like that. If I were, then I would use, like I said, some sort of disinfectant solution. There's even, ways of making sure that there's really nothing left. You could autoclave tools and things like that. For the home grower, I think that, especially if you just have a few plants, using something that you just spray some disinfectant on or you pass under a flame is usually sufficient enough.
Thanks. And you were just talking about cutting, and I was remembering that we had a photo that you had shared of cutting a stalk. Let's see if we can find it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to talk about what you were illustrating here?
Yeah. So this picture is kind of hard. There's a lot of green in here to see the contrast, but I tried to put the arrow on sort of this new growth piece so hopefully you can see that on these two photos. This is a Phalaenopsis, a very common orchid. A lot of times people ask, okay, where do I cut the stalk off? How do I cut the stalk? When can I do it? A lot of the orchids like this, the newer hybrids, they have this propensity to make a new flower stalk if you cut at the right spot. And so usually I count 3 or 4 nodes up. And the nodes you can see are kind of marked on this stalk by the little brown portion. And then you just kind of cut above the 3rd or 4th one. And then maybe a couple months later, you'll start to see a little nub of a new spike coming out. And you'll have some flowers shortly thereafter. If the stalk is super dry and brown, then you can kind of just cut it at the base. Most likely it's not gonna do this. But I say always, why not try and get another round of flowering out of your plant if you can.
Thanks, Terry. Here's a question. Someone's asking, what is the ideal humidity for an orchid? You spoke about the conditions of the room that you're in, but
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there is an ideal humidity for most orchids, and that's anywhere between like 50 to 70%, which is usually really difficult to achieve in the home. So with a lot of the orchids that people have at home, they are pretty well adapted to lower humidity. You can always group plants together or put them in a cabinet that has a sufficient light with a little humidifier, or place them on a humidity tray, and they usually appreciate that quite a bit. But for the most part, Phalaenopsis and even Paphiopedilum to some degree can deal with lower amounts of humidity that are usually typical in the home.
Thanks, Terry. And someone was asking, should orchids be misted in addition to water to sort of keep that humidity level?
Yeah, I mean, you can do that. Usually that rise in humidity is kind of transient. It doesn't, it might spike the humidity for half hour, an hour, and then it kind of just dissipates. And so it's not something that you could probably rely on to really raise your humidity all the time. But if it gives you a chance to sort of interact with your plant and you're not, causing disease by doing it, I say go for it. And then, of course, if you have a lot of aerial roots that are not in a pot, you can usually miss those, from time to time, every few days. Those roots would appreciate that.
Thank you. And someone else is asking, can they water their orchid with ice cubes?
Okay. Yeah, this one always comes up in these orchid Q&As. So the ice cube watering, I think, so I would say that, we don't do that here. But what I will say is that I think it's a very clever marketing tool that gets people to have more orchids in their home. And I think that's always great. And the thing is, it kind of does work. The idea is essentially because watering and overwatering is the number one killer of orchids. You're limiting how much water you give if you just give a couple ice cubes a week. And so it kind of keeps the orchid, moving along. But you kind of just have to think, okay, well, that's really cold water on a tropical plant. It's maybe not the best, but I have to say that for a lot of people, it does work. And if it allows them to have, these beautiful plants in their home, I say kind of why not,
Great, thank you. Here's a question about the use of Stonewool. Do you ever use that for potting? And can you explain what it is?
Yeah, so I don't know much about this mix. I know it's popular with some of the more water-loving orchids like fragmapedium, sort of in like this semi-hydroponic type of culture method. I can't really speak much to it. I'm not too familiar with using that as a media. Again, that could be a good question to follow up with the plant hotline, and then we can maybe get back to that person.
Great, thank you, Terry.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke a little bit earlier about the Smithsonian Gardens Orchid Show. Can you talk about that collaboration and sort of what the show is like now?
Yeah. So the Smithsonian Orchid Show is it's running through April. Let me see here, April 24th, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
And it's located at the National American Art Museum and Portrait Gallery in the Kogod courtyard. So really beautiful space. And they've done a really, really good job, the Smithsonian has. And essentially the collaboration is that we provide them with interesting specimens from our collection that they then integrate into their show. And so for the most part, the orchids are their collection, but we help them supplement with, like I said, really interesting specimens. If you're in the DC area or you have plans to come, before April 24th, definitely check that out.
Thank you very much, Terry, and to all of our participants for joining us today. This has been really great, really informative, and we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.